immediately stakes a claim in the center, opening diagonals for the queen and king's bishop. Setting up a solid pawn chain, this prepares a flexible defense, often leading to a Caro-Kann structure, limiting white's immediate central dominance. Securing central dominance, this advance immediately stakes a claim for greater territory. Challenging the center immediately, too, d5 opens lines and prepares for active piece play. Opening the center allows for immediate piece activity and a more open game. Reclaiming the pawn with your queen immediately opens the c-file, setting up potential pressure on white's queen side. Opening the c-file immediately creates dynamic pressure against black's central pawn structure, forcing them to make a decision about their pawn chain. Developing the knight addresses central tension and prepares castling, a sensible step in this complex Caro-Kann structure. Developing the knight to c3 efficiently guards the e4 pawn and prepares to contest central influence, adding pressure to black's pawn structure. Solidifying the pawn center and preparing for piece development, this move gracefully embraces the Caro-Kann's foundational structure. Developing this knight further solidifies the center and prepares for castling, aiming for a harmonious setup. Developing the bishop to a more active square prepares for castling and strengthens the central control. Challenging black's queenside space advantage, this thrust aims to cramp black's pieces. Safeguarding the monarch initiates crucial development, preparing for counterplay against white's ambitious pawn advances. Expanding the queenside launches a pawn storm, aiming to destabilize black's kingside and gain space for artillery. Challenging the pawn chain's advance, this pawn push creates fascinating positional exchanges on the queenside. Developing the bishop to this active square prepares castling and eyes the kingside. Preparing the bishop to eye the queenside, this repositions it from potential pawn pressure, a key defensive maneuver. Developing the bishop to a more active square, eyeing potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure and preparing for central action. Boldly challenging the center, this knight aims to disrupt white's pawn chain and potentially fork the king and queen. Unleashing a kingside attack, white aims to exploit the open diagonals. Striking at the queenside with this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's entrenched setup and create counterplay, though it opens a diagonal for the enemy bishop. Asserting control over the c5 square and opening a diagonal for the queen. Trading pawns unlocks the b-file, offering activity but risking weakened kingside defense. Opening the b-file to pressure black's queenside pawn structure after the exchange. Sacrificing the bishop opens a crucial diagonal for your queen, aiming to exploit white's slightly uncoordinated pieces. A bold queen sortie, aiming to seize initiative and potentially trap black's bishop, though it exposes the monarch to counterplay. Sacrificing the knight opens the g-file for a potential kingside attack and eliminates a key defender of white's central pawn structure. Opening the f-file grants attacking chances, but it weakens the king's protective pawn shield. Suddenly, the knight aims for the queenside, seeking active squares and challenging white's pawn chain. The rook now eyes the c-file, potentially forcing pawn exchanges and opening avenues toward black's weakened queenside structure. Seeking to disrupt white's pawn chain and expose the king, black introduces an aggressive bishop maneuver. Reuniting the rooks onto a potentially open central file is crucial for future offensive maneuvers. The bishop vacates its defensive post, inviting pressure on the queenside and opening a diagonal for potential counterplay. This rook advance aggressively pierces black's defenses, aiming to disrupt their pawn structure and exploit the weakened queenside. Initiating a counterattack on the queenside, black aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure and challenge the recently established queenside control. Striking at black's queen, white simultaneously aims to exploit the open file and disrupt any nascent pawn chain structure, potentially creating lasting weaknesses. Reclaiming material, black initiates a complex endgame struggle where precise piece placement on open files will prove paramount. Focusing the queen on the 7th rank immediately creates a persistent thorn on the kingside, a classic strategy for disrupting defensive coordination. Securing the king is paramount, and this pawn push desperately tries to create escape squares, though it weakens the pawn chain. Trading queens simplifies the position, aiming to exploit black's isolated king and potentially open lines. The rook now claims the open file, a crucial strategic pivot point as material imbalances begin to dictate the game's dynamic. Shifting the king to the newly opened f-file enhances safety and prepares for future pawn advances. Reactivating the rook on the semi-open f-file offers counterplay and rebalances the material's positional influence. Reinforcing the d-file pressure offers a clear path to central domination and potential king safety issues for black. Opening the center with this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's coordination and create dynamic play for black's pieces. Securing the open file is paramount, allowing for immediate pressure on black's vulnerable king. Opening the center with this pawn sacrifice disrupts white's coordination and offers black active counterplay. Reclaiming the center with the pawn solidifies white's central presence and opens lines for potential piece activity. Initiating a desperate attempt to activate the rook and disrupt white's central control. Recapturing the rook reestablishes pressure on the open c-file, aiming to disrupt black's coordination. Asserting control over the crucial central file immediately redeploys the rook for action. Activating the knight aggressively probes weaknesses around black's kingside, creating immediate tactical possibilities and increasing the pressure. Exchanging queens simplifies into a position where black's rook pair on the 7th rank becomes a powerful offensive force, potentially overwhelming white's king. Reclaiming the 7th rank opens up lines and promises activity for the rook. Fortifying the king's shelter with this pawn advance is a sensible defensive maneuver, though it concedes some central space. Fortifying the kingside structure, this pawn advance prepares for a more active rook presence. Pushing the pawn creates a central pawn chain, aiming to disrupt white's kingside and gain space for black's rooks. Repositioning the knight to the king's flank initiates a subtle pressure campaign against black's pawn structure. Sensing the opportunity, the bishop repositions to a more active diagonal, anticipating a potential kingside assault. Seizing the open file immediately, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and exploit the isolated d-pawn. This maneuver aims to contest the crucial central file, potentially opening lines for the bishop and preparing a counterstrike. Reclaiming the open file is paramount. The knight now targets weak squares and prepares a timely advance. This retreat aims to redeploy the bishop to a safer square, eyeing the central pawn majority. Challenging the pawn chain with this pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's central structure and gain queenside space. Attempting to disrupt white's central pawn structure, this move opens avenues but weakens the kingside. Relocating the knight to its starting square is a tactical retreat, preparing to contest central pawns. Activating the king offers a breath of fresh air for black, bringing it closer to the center's skirmishes. Unleashing a knight check forces the black king into a compromised square, disrupting any defensive coordination. Centralizing the king provides essential support for the remaining pawns in this endgame. Unifying the king with its pawns offers improved defensive stability. Opening up the kingside can be a double-edged sword, potentially creating weaknesses for your monarch while seeking active piece play. Unlocking the h-file creates immediate attacking potential against black's somewhat exposed monarch. Confronting the white king, the bishop's fork aims to disrupt white's coordination and potentially unravel their defenses. Prioritizing king safety over pawn structure, white aims to consolidate his forces and potentially activate his monarch in the ensuing exchanges. Probing the kingside with the pawn advances the endgame battle, seeking to destabilize white's structure. A sharp king hunt begins, forcing the black monarch into exposed territory. Conceding the rook trade, black simplifies into a losing pawn structure, allowing white's king to become more active. Capturing the pawn solidifies control of the crucial central squares, pushing the endgame towards a more favorable disposition for white. Seeking to regroup and consolidate, the king ventures closer to the action, eyeing potential pawn advances. Opening the central file now allows your king to become more active and a potential attacking piece. The black king, now freed from its central cage, seeks refuge on the kingside, aiming to escape the open lines. Dominating the sixth rank with the knight injects fresh pressure, forcing black into a defensive posture. Creating a new outpost for the knight, this pawn advance prepares to disrupt white's pawn chain. Re-establishing a strong knight presence on the queenside aims to harass the isolated pawn. Initiating a pawn push towards the kingside opens up attacking potential and forces white's pieces to react. Pawn capture opens the central file, creating potential for further piece activity. A solidifying maneuver, the bishop tucks away, protecting the central pawn advance. Sacrificing material for past pawn creation, this forcing check aims to destabilize black's king and advance the dangerous queenside majority.